The cafe was bustling with its usual crowd of extraterrestrial patrons, the air thick with a mix of languages, clicks, and soft hums of technology that hung in the background. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the alien city, where towering structures stretched into the sky, their jagged edges sparkling under the twin suns. Neon signs flickered in the distance, casting colorful glows across the streets as hovercars zoomed past. It was a place meant to bring different species together, a spot for all travelers to rest, converse, and escape the grind of space travel. Callie, an elderly human woman, shuffled into the cafe with a slow, deliberate gait. Her back was slightly hunched, her movements careful, though the crispness of her posture was still evident. She wore a simple, earth-tone dress, its fabric soft and faded from age. Her cane tapped lightly against the floor, its rhythmic sound oddly calming in the midst of the chaos around her. She was used to being a quiet presence in such places, human, old, and unnoticed by most. Yet, here in this alien world, her presence felt out of place. To the native species, humans were rare, mostly obsolete relics of a past war, and her age marked her even more distinctly. As she approached the counter, she was met with a series of glances from the young alien waitstaff, who clearly took note of her frailty. A few exchanged looks, their whispers hushed but audible to her sharp ears. Callie ignored them, her eyes scanning the menu overhead, its flashing holograms showing an endless array of drinks and snacks from across the galaxy. "Can I help you, old one?" The voice was harsh, dismissive. A young alien waiter, with sharp features and emerald green skin, barely glanced at her as he spoke. His tone was impatient, as if she had just interrupted his day. Callie looked at him quietly, sensing the unspoken judgment, but she chose not to react. "I'll have a tea," she said, her voice steady but soft. "Something simple, Earth-style if you have it." The waiter raised an eyebrow and then smirked. "Earth tea? You must be kidding." He turned to the display behind the counter, fiddling with a touchpad before rolling his eyes in exaggerated boredom. "Fine, Earth tea it is. You sure that's all you want? No fancy fusion drinks for someone of your advanced years?" The last words were laden with mockery, barely hidden behind his smile. Callie didn't flinch. "Yes, just the tea." She stood there, letting the silence linger for a moment before the waiter finally gestured for her to step aside. His movements sharp, like she was an inconvenience. She took a seat at a small table in the corner, an unobtrusive spot with a good view of the rest of the cafe. It was a place where, at least for a while, she wouldn't be in anyone's way. She rested her cane against the edge of the table and watched as the waiter made a show of preparing the drink, his eyes occasionally darting toward her as he muttered under his breath to another waiter nearby. Callie's sharp ears caught snippets of their conversation, mocking her age, her race, her choice of drink. She felt the heat of their words but didn't respond. Instead, she turned her attention to the other patrons, studying them with quiet curiosity. There were a few humans scattered around the cafe, mostly younger ones, but the majority of the clientele were aliens from a variety of species. Some were humanoid, their skin smooth or scaly in different shades, while others were entirely non-human, with multiple limbs or intricate markings across their faces. A few eyed Callie as they passed, their gaze lingering for a moment longer than usual, but for the most part, she was ignored. This was the way of things. Her age and humanity set her apart from the vibrant and varied crowd around her. A soft chime rang out from the bar, signaling that her tea was ready. The waiter, Zeth, she noted, picked up the cup with exaggerated care, as though it were fragile, and made his way over to her table. He set the cup down with a flourish, watching her closely for a reaction. "Here's your tea, old one," he said, voice dripping with disdain. "Hope it's to your liking." He turned on his heel before she could speak, clearly eager to move on to the next task. Callie glanced at the cup. The tea was wrong, far too hot, with a strange, foreign flavor that wasn't quite what she had asked for. She could tell he hadn't even bothered to listen to her request. His mocking tone, the dismissive gestures. It was clear that he was treating her like a relic, someone who didn't matter in the fast-paced world around her. She took a sip, and although the flavor was off, she didn't react. She could feel the eyes of the other customers on her. Some were trying to suppress smiles. Others simply stared, clearly finding amusement in the way Zeth had treated her. A faint bitterness rose in her chest, but she swallowed it down with the tea. Zeth returned to the counter, continuing his casual conversation with his colleagues, making sure to glance in her direction every few moments. Callie, for the first time, allowed herself to show the smallest sign of displeasure, a slight narrowing of her eyes. She had been humiliated before, many times in her long life, but something about this place, about the way she had been treated here, ignited a spark of defiance within her. Her hand tightened around the handle of the cup as she surveyed the cafe once more. The walls, the decor, the sophisticated tech. It was all so out of place for her. A human-owned cafe in the heart of an alien world. She had built it from nothing, starting with a dream of bringing together the cultures she had witnessed during her time serving as a strategist. The idea of intergalactic peace had seemed impossible back then, but here, in this cafe, it was real. And yet, here she was, being treated as though she didn't belong. Like she was nothing more than an old, insignificant woman with no place in the future. Her hand trembled ever so slightly, but her resolve only grew stronger. She glanced around again. Most of the patrons had turned away, continuing their conversations, completely indifferent to her. A few humans exchanged knowing glances, but none seemed willing to speak up. They all knew what it was like to be looked down upon in this alien world, but they remained silent, just like her. The waiter's mocking words still echoed in her ears. But soon that would change. She wasn't just some frail old woman. She was more than that, and she wasn't going to let Zeth's dismissal go unanswered. As Callie sat back in her chair, waiting for the moment when the full weight of her identity would be revealed, a quiet, simmering anger began to bubble inside her. She was done being ignored, done being underestimated. The cafe was hers, and it was time for Zeth and his colleagues to learn that. Callie's fingers drummed lightly against the edge of her teacup, her eyes unfocused as she stared at the swirling steam rising from the surface. The cafe's chatter and hum of activity continued around her, but in that moment, everything felt muffled, like a distant echo. She could still feel Zeth's eyes on her, the thinly veiled disdain in his gaze, but she chose to ignore it. She had dealt with far worse in her long life. She had always been underestimated. Zeth was no different from the countless others who had seen her as a fragile, inconsequential thing. But today, something inside her shifted. The mix of his mockery and the subtle alienation in the cafe began to ignite a fire she hadn't realized had been smoldering for years. Callie wasn't just any old woman. She wasn't some harmless bystander in this foreign world. She had a place here, and it was about time everyone knew it. The sound of laughter broke through her thoughts. A group of younger patrons at a nearby table were snickering at something Zeth had just said. They threw a glance toward Callie as if she weren't even worth the attention. Their amusement wasn't just directed at her. It was as if they all shared a silent understanding that she was insignificant in the grand scheme of things. She was just a relic, a human relic past her prime, too old to matter. But Callie had learned something over the years. People like them didn't see what was right in front of them. They didn't see the power that lay hidden beneath her age, beneath the wrinkles on her face and the slow movements of her hands. She had spent years shaping herself into something far more than they could ever fathom. And she was done being the quiet observer. With the last sip of tea, she set the cup down slowly, her eyes drifting over the room once more. The crowd was still loud and busy, but now it felt distant, like an old memory. She felt the weight of their disregard. But instead of it crushing her, it fueled her resolve. She wasn't here to take up space. She was here to make a statement. Zeth was still at the counter, chatting with a couple of colleagues as if nothing had happened. His earlier rudeness forgotten in his mind. The cafe's manager, a middle-aged alien with multiple eyes, was behind the bar, preparing drinks with mechanical precision, seemingly indifferent to the ongoing interactions. No one seemed to notice the tension that had started to gather around Callie, but it was there, thick and heavy in the air. As she stood up, The room seemed to hold its breath for a moment. She didn't rush. There was no need. Callie moved with deliberate slowness, her cane tapping softly against the floor with each step. Zeth glanced up at her briefly, then returned to his conversation, dismissing her once again. But this time, Callie wasn't going to let him get away with it. She walked toward the counter, her eyes never leaving Zeth's back. He didn't hear her approach until she was standing just a few feet away. The quiet of the room suddenly felt suffocating, like the calm before a storm. He turned, clearly surprised to see her so close. His casual smirk faltered for a split second before he caught himself. "What is it now?" he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Do you need help with something, old woman? Or are you just lost?" Callie met his gaze steadily, her expression unreadable. "I'm not lost," she replied, her voice cool and calm. "But you seem to be." Zeth frowned, a flicker of confusion crossing his features. "What do you mean?" Callie's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing. She didn't need to explain herself to him. Not anymore. With a swift motion, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small, sleek device. Zeth's eyes flickered toward it, then back to her, his face growing more wary by the second. She hadn't given him any reason to think she was anything more than a harmless old lady before now. But this was different. "I've been watching you," Callie said, her voice low, almost a whisper. "I know what you've been doing here." The room seemed to quiet just slightly, as if the other patrons were sensing something shifting in the air. Zeth's smug expression faltered, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. "Watching me?" he scoffed. "You're crazy. What are you talking about?" Callie didn't answer directly. Instead, she pressed a button on the device. Immediately, a holographic display sprang to life above it, showing a series of grainy videos. She tapped a few commands, and the images shifted, zooming in on various parts of the cafe. There, clearly visible, were multiple recordings of Zeth, laughing as he mocked a customer, rolling his eyes as he dismissed someone's concerns, ignoring a complaint, and worst of all, making rude comments about other patrons behind their backs. The color drained from Zeth's face as he watched the footage play out in front of him. His hands trembled slightly as the videos continued to cycle through. There was no denying it, he'd been caught. "I've been monitoring the cafe for weeks now," Callie continued, her voice firm and unyielding. "I know everything that's been happening, and I know how you've been treating people." Zeth's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. His pride had evaporated, replaced by a growing sense of panic. I didn't." "No, you didn't think anyone would notice," Callie interrupted, her eyes icy. "But I noticed, and I'm not one to let things like this slide." She took a step forward, her voice dropping lower, colder. "You're fired, Zeth." The room seemed to freeze, the buzzing of conversation around them falling into complete silence. Zeth opened his mouth to protest, but the words died on his tongue. He glanced around, but no one offered him any support. The other patrons, who had been watching the scene unfold, now turned away, pretending not to notice the growing tension between Callie and the young waiter. "You can leave now," Callie said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "And don't come back." Zeth stood there, rooted to the spot, his face flushed with embarrassment and rage. He glanced at the cafe manager, hoping for some sort of intervention, but the alien just looked back at him impassively, his eyes wide with surprise. "Leave," Callie repeated, her gaze unwavering. There was no protest. Zeth's shoulders slumped, his pride crushed, and with a final, defeated look at the others, he turned and walked toward the back exit of the cafe. As the door swung shut behind him, Callie felt the room release a collective breath. The silence lingered for a moment longer before murmurs began to ripple through the crowd. The shift in the atmosphere was palpable. Some patrons exchanged nervous glances, while others seemed impressed, though they said nothing. The manager, still behind the bar, looked at Callie with a mixture of confusion and hesitation. But for the first time since she'd entered the cafe, Callie allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. The game had just begun. The cafe settled back into its usual hum as Zeth's departure left a strange, almost surreal stillness in the air. Callie watched him leave, his broad back retreating through the door with a finality that brought a strange sense of satisfaction. She had expected resistance, expected him to argue, to fight, but there was none. His shame had been too great, and in that moment, she knew she had completely upended the power dynamics of the cafe. She took a deep breath, allowing herself a moment of quiet before turning her attention to the other patrons, whose murmurs had already begun to settle into curiosity. A few eyed her, unsure of what had just unfolded. Most, however, seemed reluctant to engage, clearly aware that something had shifted but unsure whether to speak up. The manager, who had stood frozen in place since Callie had fired Zeph, finally stirred. His eyes flicked from the door to her, and for a moment, it looked as though he might speak, but he hesitated. Callie could almost see the wheels turning in his mind, the calculations he was making. She knew he had recognized who she was. Everyone in the galaxy did. And for that brief second, he seemed to understand that things had just changed, perhaps irrevocably, in this very cafe. She didn't wait for him to make the first move. Callie moved to the bar with the same deliberate grace, her cane tapping against the floor as she approached. The manager, a tall and slightly gaunt alien with silver skin and 4 eyes, straightened behind the counter, his posture shifting to one of wary respect. He wasn't sure how to respond to her, but Callie could sense the tension in his stance, the unease as he realized that the quiet, frail old human woman wasn't someone to be taken lightly. "I'll have a refill of that tea," Callie said softly, her voice calm, though it carried an edge that made the manager hesitate for just a beat too long. Of course," he replied, his hands trembling ever so slightly as he went to work, carefully pouring the tea. "Is there anything else, ma'am?" Callie gave a thin, knowing smile. "Not yet," she said, her eyes narrowing. "But you might want to make sure the staff here understands something." The manager paused, glancing up from his task. "Understand? What, exactly?" "That there are consequences for how you treat your customers," she said, her voice low but firm. "And that includes how you treat me." The manager flinched slightly, his 4 eyes blinking rapidly. He had been around long enough to know the significance of her words, though it seemed like a part of him couldn't quite grasp that this frail, elderly woman was capable of demanding respect. I apologize for Zeth's behavior," he stammered, his voice lacking the usual authority he carried with his employees. "It won't happen again. You have my word." Callie studied him for a moment, her eyes not leaving his face. He was nervous, but more than that, he was cautious. He knew who she was, knew that beneath the facade of aging skin and slow movements, she was someone with power, someone who could destroy businesses with the stroke of a pen, and who had the authority to shut entire sectors down if she felt the need to. "I'll be keeping an eye on this place," she said after a moment, her gaze still sharp. "You run a tight ship here. I'd hate to see things fall apart just because of a few bad employees." The manager swallowed hard and nodded quickly, not daring to argue. "Understood, ma'am. I'll make sure everything is as it should be." Callie nodded in return, a satisfied gleam in her eye. "Good," she said simply, then took her tea from him and turned to leave the bar. As she made her way back to her table, she felt the weight of the eyes on her once more. The other patrons were still whispering among themselves, but now their whispers were full of curiosity. What had just happened? Why had Zeph left so abruptly? And who was this woman, really? The tension in the room was palpable, but Callie felt an odd sense of calm wash over her. She was used to this kind of attention. She'd faced it for decades after all. The whispers, the sidelong glances, the way people tried to make her feel small. It didn't bother. The sun had long since set, and the bustling cafe that had been full of energy hours before had begun to quiet down. The low hum of conversation had tapered off, with only a few scattered patrons left nursing their drinks. Callie lingered at her table, still sipping the last remnants of her tea, the warmth of the cup in her hands grounding her as the events of the afternoon replayed in her mind. She had made her point with Zeth. The thought of his humiliation brought a small, private smile to her lips. But it wasn't just the boy's defeat that satisfied her. It was the realization that she hadn't just been a passive observer anymore. For once, she had been in control. That feeling of power, of authority was intoxicating. It wasn't something she'd felt in a long time, but it was something she had once known all too well. The door to the cafe opened with a soft chime, and Callie glanced up, noting the figure who entered. It was the cafe manager, his 4 eyes scanning the room before landing on her. He hesitated, then moved toward her table with deliberate steps. He was alone, which suggested that whatever he was about to say was important. "Ma'am," he said respectfully, his tone careful but far more deferential than it had been earlier. "I wanted to apologize again, and to thank you for your patience. We've had a long discussion about Seth's behavior, and I assure you he won't be coming back. The staff and I have agreed that we will maintain higher standards from here on out." Callie studied him for a moment, the coolness of her gaze making him squirm slightly. "That's good to hear," she said, her voice soft but carrying a weight that seemed to echo in the quiet space between them. "But it's not just about Seth. You see, I don't take well to being dismissed or ignored, and I'm sure you can imagine how that feels." The manager's throat worked as he swallowed, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. He wasn't used to this side of Callie, the one who commanded authority without ever raising her voice. "I understand," he said, "and I don't want you to feel disrespected here again. Please, if there's anything more we can do for you." Callie didn't let him finish. She held up a hand, cutting him off with a sharp motion. "I don't need anything from you," she said, "but I would like you to do something for me. For all your staff, really." The manager raised an eyebrow, curiosity piqued. "Of course, ma'am. What is it?" Callie's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "You'll give them a reminder of who's in charge here. Make it clear that no one is above respect, especially when it comes to those who've earned their place. I don't think any of them understand that yet." He hesitated, a flash of doubt crossing his face before he nodded, albeit reluctantly. I'll see what I can do." Callie leaned back in her chair, assessing him silently for a long moment. There was something in his eyes now, something that wasn't there earlier. Fear? No, it wasn't fear exactly, it was respect. The kind that came when someone realized they were standing before a force to be reckoned with. "You'll do more than that," Callie said finally. "Make it clear that no one treats my people that way again. Understood?" "Yes, ma'am," he answered quickly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll take care of it." Callie nodded once, her smile growing faint. "Good," she said, rising from her seat. She placed a generous tip on the table before she turned to leave. As she made her way toward the exit, the manager watched her, his posture stiff, but now there was an unmistakable sense of respect in the way he carried himself. Whatever had transpired earlier had changed something in him. He had seen the calm, controlled force she was, and now he knew better than to underestimate her. The night air hit Callie as she stepped outside the cafe, the chill brushing against her skin. She breathed in deeply, taking in the faint scent of the city as she walked through the bustling streets. The galaxy was full of strange worlds and cultures, but none of them mattered to her like the power she carried with her every day. Her footsteps echoed on the cobblestones as she continued her walk, her mind spinning with the events of the day. She hadn't planned on making waves at the cafe, but it felt good to remind them of who she was. It had been far too long since she'd had the opportunity to be in control, and yet, a part of her knew that this was just the beginning. Seth had been a minor player in her eyes, easily dispatched. The manager, while obedient for now, would likely need reminding in the future. But she wasn't interested in small victories. No, Callie had much larger plans in mind. The city lights flickered overhead, and she turned a corner, heading for the building she'd rented for her stay. She wasn't sure how long she would be here. Could be days or it could be weeks. But it didn't matter. She'd come to this alien world for a reason, and everything was falling into place. Inside her temporary residence, she made her way to the living area, her cane tapping softly against the marble floors. She set it aside and collapsed onto a plush chair, allowing herself a brief moment of respite. As she settled, Her eyes were drawn to the small holoscreen on the wall. A flicker of light interrupted her thoughts, and she reached forward, activating the device. The screen flickered to life, revealing a familiar face. A colleague, one of the few she trusted. "Callie," the figure said, their voice smooth but serious. "We've received word that there may be someone looking for you, a certain individual from your past. Someone you might want to avoid." Callie's heart skipped a beat, but her expression didn't falter. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "Who is it?" "An old acquaintance," the figure replied cryptically. "They've been asking around, looking for information." Callie's mind raced. She had enemies, of course she did. She wasn't naive. But this was unexpected. "What do they want?" The figure on the screen hesitated before answering. "They're coming for you, Callie. You should prepare yourself." Callie's fingers clenched into fists. It seemed her actions today had caused more ripples than she anticipated. This wouldn't be over so easily. She didn't say anything else, only nodded before the screen shut off with a soft beep. A new game had begun. Callie's hand hovered over the holoscreen for a moment longer, her fingers tingling with the sudden surge of tension. The warning had been enough to snap her into alertness, and for the first time that evening, the calm facade she had worn throughout her interactions cracked, revealing a flicker of uncertainty. She had known there would be consequences for what she'd done at the cafe, knew that stirring the pot would inevitably draw attention. But she hadn't expected this, hadn't anticipated that someone from her past would resurface so soon. The figure on the screen had been cryptic as always, but the message had been clear. Someone was coming for her. Someone who knew too much, someone who could ruin everything if given the chance. Sighing, Callie sank back into the plush chair, the weight of the situation settling over her like a heavy cloak. It wasn't a new feeling. She had lived her life in a constant state of being hunted, pursued by ghosts from her past, enemies who had always been lurking just out of sight. But now, the idea that one of them had found her again, it was unsettling to say the least. With a sharp motion, she swiped her hand across the air, pulling up a series of dossiers on the holoscreen. Names, faces, and events scrolled before her eyes. A sea of familiar and unfamiliar faces. It took her only a few moments to locate the name she'd been searching for. Caden. A name she hadn't heard in years. A name that brought a rush of memories flooding back. Caden had been a former colleague, once a trusted ally in her network. But that was before everything fell apart, before the betrayal. Caden had always been ambitious, more than she had ever trusted him to be, and it had cost them both dearly. She had walked away from him, and since then, she had kept her distance. The years of silence between them had been necessary. His ambition had turned dangerous, and his resentment had grown. Now, it seemed, that old resentment was back to haunt her. The sound of footsteps outside her door interrupted her thoughts. Callie's eyes snapped toward the entryway, her senses immediately on high alert. She hadn't ordered anyone, and this was the time when most people were winding down for the evening. Her hand moved instinctively to the holoscreen's control panel, turning off the display with a soft swipe. She wasn't expecting company, but she had learned long ago to never be unprepared. A light knock at the door brought her fully to attention. She stood from the chair, the soft rustle of fabric as she moved almost imperceptible in the quiet room. She glanced through the small window beside the door, spotting the silhouette of a figure standing outside. A flash of recognition ran through her, though she couldn't place the face immediately. When she opened the door, she was met by the sight of the cafe manager, the one who had been so eager to please earlier in the day. His 4 eyes blinked nervously as he shifted his weight from foot to foot, clearly uncomfortable in the unexpected confrontation. "Ma'am," he said, his voice tinged with hesitation. I'm sorry to disturb you at this hour. I wanted to make sure you were all right, after what happened today with Zeph." Callie studied him for a moment, wondering why he had come. It wasn't uncommon for customers to check in after a tense interaction, but this felt different. There was an urgency in his posture, something he was holding back. She raised an eyebrow, her expression inscrutable. "You're far from the cafe. she said, her voice low. What is it you want? The manager shifted again, clearly unsure whether to speak or to retreat. It's just, I don't know if you're aware, but there's been some talk around the sector about you. People are curious, and some of them are not so friendly. Callie's gaze sharpened, the coolness of her demeanor returning. I don't need rumors spreading, she said evenly. If you've come here to warn me, I suggest you leave. I'm perfectly capable of handling myself. The manager nodded quickly, but there was a trace of something else in his expression. Fear, maybe, or respect. He seemed to be struggling with something, as if there was more he wanted to say but couldn't quite bring himself to. I didn't mean to cause trouble, he murmured, then turned to leave, clearly sensing that the conversation was over. But just as he took a step back, Callie's voice stopped him. Hold on. He turned, his expression shifting to one of confusion. Ma'am. She paused for a moment, then stepped aside, motioning for him to enter. You're already here, she said, her tone carrying an odd mixture of dismissal and invitation. You may as well tell me what you've come to say. The manager hesitated for only a beat longer before stepping inside. The door closed softly behind him, and the tension in the room seemed to grow thicker. He looked around the space nervously, his eyes darting from the sleek furnishings to the soft lighting, as if trying to read the atmosphere. Callie didn't move, keeping a deliberate distance as she waited for him to gather his thoughts. Finally, he spoke, his words slow and measured. There's a group, he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. A group of people who are very interested in you. They've been asking questions, poking around, and I'm not sure who they are, but they're dangerous, Callie. I can tell. And they're getting closer. The words hit her like a cold blast of air, but Callie's expression remained unchanged. And what do you expect me to do about it? She asked, her voice steady. I just wanted to warn you. I don't know what they want, but it's not good. I've seen their kind before, and they're not the type to back down easily. You're powerful, but Callie cut him off with a sharp motion of her hand. But nothing, she said. You came to warn me because you're scared, but you're wasting your time. If they want me, they'll come. And when they do, they'll regret it. The manager swallowed hard, but there was something in his eyes now, an understanding, a recognition of her resolve. He nodded slowly, stepping back toward the door. I didn't mean to intrude, he said softly, but I just wanted to make sure you were prepared. Callie gave him a small, thin smile. I'm always prepared. As the manager left, she stood still for a moment, the quiet of the room enveloping her once more. The group he spoke of, this unknown danger, they were closing in. But Callie wasn't afraid. Not anymore. She moved back to the holoscreen, bringing up the dossiers again. It was time to prepare for what was coming. The game had only just begun, and this time, there would be no hesitation. Callie paced in front of the holoscreen, her mind racing through the possibilities. The warning from the cafe manager echoed in her thoughts, his words heavy with a mixture of fear and respect. She had expected trouble eventually, she always did, but she hadn't anticipated someone from her past resurfacing so suddenly, bringing with them the threat of an unknown group. Her enemies never took long to find her, but this time, it felt different. This time, they were coming for her with an urgency she hadn't expected. The quiet hum of the room was broken only by the soft swipes of her fingers across the control panel, pulling up various encrypted files and contact logs. She needed to know who was behind this. The group the manager had spoken of could be anyone. Old rivals, opportunistic criminals, or someone even more dangerous. The fact that they were asking about her meant they already knew something important. And she wasn't about to wait around to find out what that might be. The screen flickered to life, displaying a list of potential leads. Names, faces, and organizations scrolled before her eyes, each entry meticulously researched. Callie's hand hovered over the list, picking out the individuals who seemed most likely to be involved. One name stood out more than the others. Caden. He had been the one to betray her all those years ago. If he was involved, Then things were about to get far more complicated. She took a deep breath and leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping against the armrest in thought. Caden's ambition had always been his downfall, and she had no doubt he was behind whatever this group was. If he was coming for her, she needed to be prepared. Not just for him, but for the unknown forces he might have gathered. She wasn't a stranger to enemies, but this time, she had to play the game differently. The sound of her door opening interrupted her thoughts. She turned to find the manager from the cafe standing in the doorway once again, his expression tense but determined. He was holding a small data pad in his hands, his fingers clutching it with an almost frantic grip. I thought you should have this," he said, his voice edged with urgency. "It's from the group I told you about. I wasn't sure if you'd want to see it, but I thought you should know." Callie studied him carefully. His earlier fear had been replaced by something else now. Resignation, maybe, or a sense of guilt. She wasn't sure which. She nodded, gesturing for him to step inside. Without a word, he moved toward the desk and handed her the datapad. "Thank you," she said coolly. But her eyes never left his face. There was something about the way he was acting now, almost as if he regretted his actions. She had dealt with people like him before, those who were too eager to please and yet, when the time came to stand up, faltered. She turned her attention to the pad and activated it, the screen illuminating with a series of messages and data files. The first thing she noticed was the name at the top, Caden Gallo. Her pulse quickened, but she kept her expression neutral as the screen scrolled down, revealing a list of encrypted communications and notes, many of which seemed to be discussing her. The manager watched her closely as she absorbed the information. "I wasn't sure how much you knew about this," he said quietly, shifting his weight nervously. "But the group, they're not just looking for you. They're targeting people connected to you. They want to make a statement." Callie's lips tightened. So it wasn't just her. They were targeting anyone who might be a threat to them. The familiar sensation of being hunted crept up her spine, but she was no stranger to it. She had always known how to outmaneuver her pursuers. "I see," she said, her voice even. "And you think this group has the power to follow through on their threats?" The manager hesitated. "I don't know for sure, but they're organized and they have resources. I've seen people like this before. They don't back down easily." Callie raised an eyebrow, her gaze piercing as she regarded him. "Then why come to me now?" she asked. "Why warn me?" His face flushed, a mixture of guilt and fear crossing his features. "Because I don't want to see anyone get hurt, and because I know what they're capable of. If you don't do something now, it could be too late." Callie's mind whirred with the implications. The manager's fear was palpable, but it wasn't just his safety he was worried about. He was concerned about hers as well. The idea that someone like Caden was involved in this group only added to the danger. He knew her too well, and if she wasn't careful, he could use that knowledge against her. "Thank you," she said again. Her tone softened just enough to let him know she wasn't dismissing him completely. "You've done what you can. Now it's my turn." The manager gave a quick nod, his relief evident. He glanced around nervously, as though unsure whether he should leave or stay. Finally, he turned and walked toward the door, pausing to look back at Callie. "I hope you'll be careful," he said quietly, his voice barely audible. "I always am," Callie replied. Once the door closed behind him, she was alone again. She let out a breath, her mind already working out the next steps. The group that was after her was more dangerous than she had anticipated, but she wasn't going to let them win. She had been underestimated too many times before, and she wasn't about to make the same mistake again. She returned to the holoscreen, pulling up a secure communications channel. It was time to contact her old allies, the ones who owed her favors, or perhaps the ones who needed to. She wasn't going to face this threat alone. As she worked, the familiar weight of the situation settled over her. There was always a moment of stillness before the storm, a calm before the chaos erupted. Callie had learned to embrace it. This was the part where she planned, where she strategized, and where she made sure nothing was left to chance. Her eyes flickered over the data pad once more. Caden was coming, And if there was one thing she knew for certain, it was that she couldn't let him get the upper hand. She wasn't just fighting for her own survival. She was fighting for control. With a determined sigh, she picked up the pad and began to formulate her plan. This time, she would be the one making the first move. The group had no idea what they were about to face. Callie sat in the dimly lit room, the hum of the holoscreen in front of her, the only sound that broke the silence. The file she had pulled up, detailing the people who might be involved in this growing threat, spread across the screen like an intricate web, names and faces flashing by with each swipe of her hand. As her fingers skimmed through the data, her mind raced, connecting the dots between those she could trust and those who could betray her. She had always prided herself on her ability to keep a cool head in the face of danger. But the situation was growing more complex by the minute. The group after her, led by the ever-ambitious Caden, was more organized than she had expected. He had gathered powerful individuals, those willing to do anything to climb the ladder, and that meant Callie was in serious jeopardy. But it wasn't just Caden's group that worried her. The manager from the cafe had been right about one thing. There were bigger forces at play here. This wasn't just about settling old scores. It was about making a statement. The people targeting her weren't just looking to bring her down. They wanted to send a message. And if Callie knew anything, it was that people with power, people like Caden, didn't play by the same rules. They played for keeps. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sudden ping of an incoming message. Callie's heart rate spiked, and she immediately recognized the encryption signature. It was from one of her trusted contacts. Without hesitation, she activated the message. The face that appeared on the screen was one she hadn't seen in years, but the voice was unmistakable. Callie, I don't know how much time I have, but you need to listen carefully. Things are worse than you think, the voice said, his tone urgent but calm. The group behind Caden is deeper than you realize. They have connections everywhere, and they're coming for everyone associated with you. If you don't act fast, this won't just be a personal vendetta anymore. They'll come after your entire network. Callie's grip on the desk tightened, the weight of the situation sinking in. She had known it was bad, but hearing it from someone she trusted only confirmed her worst fears. The stakes were higher now. It wasn't just about survival, it was about protecting everything she had built. I've been tracking their movements, the voice continued, and I found something. There's a meeting happening soon, an exchange. If you can get there, if you can intercept it, you might be able to shut this down before it gets out of hand. But you need to be quick. Callie's mind raced. An exchange. It could be the leverage she needed to turn the tide in her favor. But getting to the meeting wouldn't be easy. Caden's people would be heavily guarded. And if this was a trap, it could end up being her last mistake. Where is it? She asked, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The contact's face tightened with worry. I can't give you all the details yet. You'll have to trust me. But I'll send you the location as soon as I can. Just be careful. If Caden's learned anything from you, it's that you're always one step ahead. He'll be ready. The message ended abruptly, leaving Callie staring at the blank screen. A surge of anger rose within her. Caden had always been a step behind, always trying to play catch-up. But this time he had managed to surprise her, and she didn't like it. The thought of him having the upper hand, of him being the one to dictate the terms, was unacceptable. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. Without wasting another second, she started gathering her things, her mind already working on a plan. She would need allies and she would need to move quickly. If this meeting was the key to dismantling Caden's group, she had to be there. Callie didn't hesitate as she activated the security system in the room, ensuring all exits were sealed and monitored. It was a precaution she had grown used to over the years, one that ensured she was never caught off guard. She then accessed the private communication line to her network. She needed someone she could trust, someone who could assist her in getting to the location. Within moments, a familiar face appeared on the screen. Marcus, one of her most trusted operatives. His rugged features and calm demeanor gave him an air of confidence, but Callie knew better than to underestimate him. Marcus was a problem solver, someone who could be counted on when the stakes were high. What's going on, Callie? Marcus asked, his voice steady but with a hint of concern. He could tell something was off. I've got a lead, Callie replied, her voice sharp and precise. There's a meeting happening, and if I can get there, I can intercept whatever deal Caden's making. It's our chance to stop him before he gets too far. Marcus's eyes narrowed. I'm in. Just tell me when and where. Callie paused for a moment, considering the risks. I don't know if this is a trap, Marcus. Could be. But if we don't take the risk, Caden wins. I need you to be ready for anything. Marcus nodded. I'm already packed. I'll meet you at the rendezvous point. We'll handle it. With the plan in place, Callie set her sights on the meeting. The uncertainty of what was to come buzzed in the back of her mind. But she knew there was no turning back now. The time for caution had passed. It was time to confront Caden and his people, to take control of the situation once and for all. She gathered her equipment, a small arsenal of tools and weapons she knew would help her if things went south. Callie didn't like to rely on brute force, but in this case, she wasn't going to take any chances. As she headed for the exit, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The manager from the cafe had said that people were after her. He had mentioned the group being connected to Caden, but Callie had to wonder, was Caden really the mastermind behind all of this? Or was he just another pawn in a much bigger game? The thought gnawed at her as she stepped into the night, the cool air brushing against her skin. She wasn't just fighting for her own survival anymore. She was fighting to maintain control of her life, of the empire she had built. The group who had come after her didn't understand the magnitude of the danger they were facing. They thought they could take her down, but they had underestimated her before, and they would do so again. With every step, the plan began to form in her mind, and the sense of purpose grew stronger. She was ready. Callie moved swiftly through the crowded streets of the city, her pace steady and deliberate. The night had fallen, blanketing the city in a mixture of neon lights and shadows, the towering structures of the metropolis casting long, dark silhouettes. The air was thick with the hum of distant traffic and the muffled conversations of passers-by. She was used to the constant noise, the feeling of anonymity among the throngs of people. Tonight, though, it felt suffocating. There was no escaping the weight of the mission that loomed ahead. Her mind raced, replaying the cryptic message from her contact, the one who had warned her of the meeting. She still couldn't shake the feeling that this was a trap. But if it was, Callie had no intention of walking right into it unprepared. She had survived far worse. She had learned over the years that survival wasn't just about strength. It was about outthinking your opponent, anticipating their moves before they made them. Marcus had already confirmed that he would meet her at the rendezvous point. She had trusted him for years, and she knew he would be ready for anything. But even so, she couldn't shake the nagging suspicion that there were forces at play far beyond her control. Her enemies were always one step ahead, always moving faster than she could react. The rendezvous point was an old warehouse, abandoned and hidden in plain sight among the industrial sector of the city. The building had seen better days, its rusted metal walls and cracked windows telling the story of years of neglect. It was the perfect place for a secret meeting, far from the prying eyes of the public, and well out of the reach of the city's law enforcement. As she approached the warehouse, Callie slowed her pace, scanning the area for any signs of movement. She had been trained to be observant, to trust her instincts, and tonight those instincts were telling her something was off. The shadows seemed too deep, the silence too absolute. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Taking a deep breath, she adjusted the strap of her bag, the weight of her weapons and gadgets barely noticeable now. Her hand brushed against the concealed communicator tucked beneath her jacket. She hadn't activated it yet, but the moment things went wrong, she would. She just had to make it through the next few minutes without tipping off whoever was waiting for her. When she reached the entrance of the warehouse, she paused. The door was slightly ajar, just enough to let a sliver of light escape from inside. She could hear muffled voices from within, the sound of hurried conversation. Marcus was already there, she was sure of it. But who else? And why the secrecy? She pushed the door open quietly, stepping into the dimly lit space. The air was thick with dust, the scent of rust and mildew lingering in the corners of the room. Shadows moved along the walls, cast by the sparse lighting. Callie's eyes adjusted quickly, her gaze sweeping over the interior. She spotted Marcus immediately, standing near the far wall, his posture tense, his eyes scanning the shadows. But there were others here too, figures she didn't recognize. One of the figures stepped forward. A man with a face that was both familiar and unfamiliar. His sharp features, once youthful but now hardened by time and experience, were unmistakable. It was Caden. Callie's breath caught in her throat. She had expected him to be here, but seeing him in person, standing so close, sent a ripple of tension through her body. She could feel the weight of the past pressing on her, the years of betrayal and animosity coming to a head in this very moment. The man who had once been her partner, the one who had shared her ambitions and dreams, was now her enemy. "You're late," Caden said, his voice cold and smooth, carrying an undercurrent of contempt. He didn't move toward her, but his gaze never left her, sizing her up like a predator observing its prey. "I was beginning to wonder if you had second thoughts." Callie didn't flinch. She had learned long ago not to show weakness in front of him. She met his gaze with a cool, calculated look of her own. "I'm not here to waste time, Caden. I'm here to end this." A sly smile curved on his lips. "End it? You think you can just waltz in here and put an end to everything? You've already lost, Callie. You just haven't realized it yet." The words stung, but she refused to let them show. Instead, she took a step forward, her boots scraping against the concrete floor. "You always did talk too much. Where's the exchange, Caden? Or is this all just a diversion?" At her words, the others in the room shifted, their eyes darting between her and Caden. There were 3 of them, 2 men and a woman, each of them armed, their postures tense and ready for action. They were here for a reason, and Callie knew better than to assume they were just bystanders. Caden's smile widened, but there was no humor in it. "The exchange?" he repeated, his tone dripping with mockery. "There is no exchange, Callie. This isn't about money or power. It's about control. And right now, you're the one who's out of control." She took another step, closing the distance between them. "I've always been in control, Caden. You never understood that, but you will. Soon." For a moment there was silence. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Callie could feel her heart racing, adrenaline pumping through her veins. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the confrontation that would decide everything. Caden's eyes flickered toward his associates, his expression hardening. "You really think you can walk out of here alive, Callie? Do you think you can just keep running from the mess you've made of everything?" "I'm not running," Callie replied, her voice low but firm. "But I am done cleaning up your mess." Without warning, she moved, her hand darting beneath her jacket and drawing a small, concealed weapon. The action was quick, fluid, a move she had practiced countless times. The weapon wasn't meant to kill, but it was powerful enough to incapacitate. A shot rang out, the electric pulse hitting one of Caden's associates square in the chest. The man dropped to the ground with a sharp gasp, his body twitching as the stun shot took effect. The others reacted instantly, reaching for their own weapons. But Callie was already in motion, her body moving with practiced precision. She ducked low, avoiding the spray of gunfire as she closed the distance between herself and Caden. "You always were too quick to pull the trigger," Caden muttered, his face a mixture of irritation and grudging respect. "But this time it won't save you." Callie didn't respond. She didn't need to. She had a plan and she would see it through to the end. Caden was about to learn that underestimating her had always been his greatest mistake. The warehouse was alive with chaos. Caden's associates scrambled for cover as Callie's stun shot incapacitated one of them. But the others were fast, pulling weapons and returning fire with precise, calculated shots. Callie didn't flinch. She was too well trained for that. The staccato rhythm of gunfire echoed through the cavernous space, bouncing off the rusted walls and filling the room with the sound of impending danger. But Callie had been through worse. She wasn't just reacting to the moment. She was controlling it. She ducked low behind a stack of crates, pulling out a small device from her bag. With a few quick taps on the touchscreen, she activated it, sending a signal to Marcus. He had been waiting outside, ready to spring into action when the time came. He had always been good at getting into the right position, and now he was going to make his move. As the firefight raged on, Callie kept her head down, her thoughts moving faster than her enemies could react. Caden was right. He had always been a step ahead in one way or another. But tonight, she was closing the gap. She didn't just want to end this fight. She wanted to take everything Caden had built and watch it crumble before his eyes. With the device still active in her hand, Callie could hear Marcus's voice coming through the earpiece, low and calm. "I'm in position. You ready?" "Always," she replied, her voice steady. "Wait for my signal." She didn't have to look up to know where Caden was. He hadn't moved since the first stun shot. He was still standing at the far end of the warehouse, watching her, assessing her every move. His cold eyes never left her, calculating, waiting for the right moment to strike. But Callie wasn't going to give him that moment. She took a deep breath, slipping her hand into her jacket and drawing another device, a small EMP grenade. It wasn't lethal, but it would disable all the electronics in the immediate area, including their weapons and communication devices. She couldn't afford another second of their ability to coordinate. The element of surprise was her greatest advantage right now. The grenade was a small, sleek thing, but it packed a punch. Callie pulled the pin with practiced ease and threw it toward the center of the room. There was a split second of silence, and then a sharp, crackling burst of static filled the air as the EMP went off. Lights flickered, weapons malfunctioned, and the sound of gunfire stopped abruptly. The room fell into an eerie quiet, the only sound the distant hum of the city outside. For a moment, everyone stood still, trying to process what had just happened. It was enough of an opening. "Now," Callie barked, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife. In an instant, Marcus was in motion, charging into the warehouse through a side entrance. His heavy footsteps were the only warning before he barreled into the room, his own weapon drawn and ready. His presence was enough to throw the remaining operatives off balance, and Callie seized the moment. She rose from behind the crates and sprinted toward Caden. He had been stunned by the EMP blast, but now he was recovering, his gaze narrowing as he reached for a backup weapon, one that hadn't been affected by the EMP. Callie was faster. With a sharp twist of her wrist, she grabbed his arm mid-reach, twisting it behind his back and slamming him against the cold concrete floor. Caden's breath was knocked out of him, and he let out a grunt of pain as he struggled to break free. But Callie wasn't letting go. "Not this time," she said through gritted teeth, her voice cold as ice. Caden's eyes flashed with anger as he tried to fight her off, but it was no use. Callie had him pinned, and now he was the one at her mercy. She could feel the weight of his defiance, but it didn't matter. Not anymore. "Do you really think you've won, Callie?" Caden hissed, his voice strained. "This isn't over. You're not the one in control here." Callie didn't flinch. She had heard it all before. The bravado, the arrogance, the false sense of power. She had watched him build his empire on the backs of people like her, using manipulation and deceit to climb higher and higher. But in the end, it had all been hollow. "Not anymore," she said, her voice firm and resolute. "It's over, Caden." Before he could respond, she pressed a small device against the back of his neck, another tracking device, one that would send a signal to the authorities. Callie had no intention of killing him. She had seen enough bloodshed in her life. Caden would live, but he would face the consequences of his actions. The authorities would take care of the rest. His empire was about to come crashing down. The sound of sirens filled the air as law enforcement closed in, their vehicles arriving just outside the warehouse. Callie didn't wait for them to enter. She knew they would take care of Caden and his associates from here. She had done what she came to do. As she stepped back, releasing her hold on Caden, she felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. It had been a long night, and the weight of everything that had happened still hung heavy in the air. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of peace. She had done what needed to be done. She had taken control back. Marcus appeared at her side, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the scene. "It's done," he said simply. Callie nodded, her gaze fixed on Caden, who was now on his knees, handcuffed and surrounded by law enforcement. She didn't feel any triumph, no sense of victory. She had never been in this for the glory. But there was a satisfaction in knowing that Caden's reign of manipulation and betrayal was over. "Are you sure about this?" Marcus asked, his voice low. "You could have killed him." Callie shook her head. "I'm done with killing, Marcus. Let the system handle him now." Marcus didn't argue. He knew better than to push her on matters like this. Instead, he offered her a quiet nod of approval. As the authorities took over, Callie stepped away from the scene, the weight of the past few days lifting off her shoulders. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, she felt free. The threat was gone, and with it, the shadows that had loomed over her for so long. The war was over and Callie had won. But it wasn't a victory she would celebrate. It was simply the end of a chapter, and the beginning of whatever came next.